The sound comes before the light, before the flash, before the concussion, before the splinters of pine that move faster than any rifle round. There is the sound of the tree breaking apart above you. They called it a tree burst. The Germans had spent 3 decades perfecting it, the precise artillery elevation required to detonate a shell not at the ground, but at the canopy 20 meters up. So that the branches and the bark and the heartwood of a German pine became 10,000 pieces of shrapnel falling on the men who had been smart enough to take cover between the trunks. They had written it into doctrine. They had trained entire artillery batteries to do exactly this. They understood at a level that became institutional that in a forest the ground is not the threat, the forest itself is the threat. November 1944. The Hürtgen Forest on the German-Belgian border, 54 square miles of spruce and pine and ancient dark, fortified with concrete pillboxes, laced with wire and mines, manned by Wehrmacht infantry who had trained in this terrain for years. The 28th Infantry Division, the Keystone Division, the Pennsylvania National Guard, sent 6,184 men into this forest in the first week of November. In 4 days, 2,000 of them were gone. Dead, wounded, or missing in undergrowth so dense that a man could disappear from his squad's sight in 12 feet. The forest didn't just beat them, it swallowed them, but that is not the story. The story is what happened 6 weeks later in the southern Hürtgen, when a staff sergeant from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, took 11 men into the same darkness with a different question in his mind. The Germans treated the forest as a wall. What if you treated it as a weapon? That question has one answer, and it starts not with firepower, not with numbers. It starts with a framework. 2 armies looked at the same trees, one of them was right. December 7, 1944, Brandenburg-Bergstein sector, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Eisenhower was 300 miles away, in his headquarters at Versailles, when he wrote the directive that would eventually reach the hands of a staff sergeant crouching in the Belgian dark. He was working from maps, beautiful, detailed, topographically precise maps that showed every ridge, every road, every watercourse in the Hürtgen. What they showed where the forest was, green, solid green. A flat color on paper where in reality there were 54 square miles of overlapping shadow and silence and German machine gun nests, positioned at every avenue a trained infantry officer would have considered approaching. The directive read, in part, "The man on the ground will always know something the map does not show. Our job is to train him well enough to act on that knowledge before the enemy acts on his ignorance." This was not standard military language in December 1944. The Wehrmacht did not write orders like this. The Red Army did not write orders like this. Dwight D. Eisenhower wrote orders like this because he had built his entire command philosophy, what SHAEF planners called initiative within intent, around a specific bet, that a well-trained American sergeant, trusted to act on what his eyes and his boots told him, was worth more in a fluid engagement than any tactical doctrine printed in any manual. He was about to be proven right. The proof would cost 11 men a great deal. Staff Sergeant Thomas "Tom" Gallagher was 26 years old, from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and before the war he had taught geography at a small high school outside the city. Not history, not mathematics. Geography, the study of how the Earth's physical features shape the decisions of every creature that has ever tried to live on its surface. He understood terrain the way most men understood rooms, not as abstract space, but as a series of opportunities and constraints, each one leading inevitably to the next. He carried in the breast pocket of his field jacket a single photograph. His daughter, Clara, 3 months old, photographed in a Milwaukee hospital room where his wife Margaret had given birth in September, while Gallagher was moving through the hedgerows of Normandy. He had never held the child. He pressed his palm against the photograph approximately once per hour, through the fabric, the way a man touches something he cannot afford to look at until the business in front of him is finished. He had been with the 22nd Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, the Ivy Division, since North Africa. He had been in enough terrain to know the difference between a map's promise and a forest's reality. The two rarely agreed. His squad, Private First Class Raymond Okaffer, 23, from Detroit, Michigan, the steadiest man on point that Gallagher had ever worked with, a man who moved through undergrowth the way water moves through a landscape, finding the path that exists rather than the one that should. Corporal Jesse Taft, 28, Tulsa, Oklahoma, former roughneck, former amateur boxer, a man who could carry a wounded soldier through broken terrain without slowing the column measurably. Private Danny Kowalczyk, 19, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the youngest, the one who asked the most questions, the one who would never stop being 19 in Gallagher's memory. 7 others whose names appear in the regimental after-action report filed December 14, 1944. 11 men total. Their mission: advance through the southeastern edge of the Brandenburg Ridge Forest, locate and neutralize a German observation post at grid reference 423. 7. And secure the Forest Road junction at that grid reference, a junction that was blocking the advance of 4th Division armor toward the Roa River dams. If the dams fell into German hands intact, or if the Germans destroyed them at the wrong moment, the entire First Army advance could be stopped by flooding for weeks. 11 men, a road junction, the difference between an armored advance and a flood. The plan, as drawn at battalion level, was direct: follow the existing forest path to within 300 meters of the objective, split into 2 fire teams, approach from the northeast and the northwest simultaneously, 45 minutes maximum. The aerial reconnaissance photographs taken from 8,000 feet showed the path clear and the forest floor open. The photographs showed the tops of the trees, they did not show what was between them. German forest doctrine, Waldkampf, literally forest battle, was not improvised. It was the product of decades of thinking about exactly this problem. How do you fight in terrain where visibility is 15 to 20 meters and every direction looks identical? The Wehrmacht's answer was systematic and sophisticated. You defend from prepared interior positions, perpendicular to the most likely approach routes. You use the terrain to funnel the enemy toward kill zones they cannot see until they are standing in them. You plan your defensive lines around the assumption that any attacking force will follow the logic of the ground: roads, clearings, the path of least resistance. What Waldkampf did not account for was a soldier who refused to follow that logic. Hauptmann Werner Struck, commanding the 275th Infantry Division's forward battalion in the Brandenburg sector, had been in the Hürtgen for 11 weeks. He knew this forest the way Gallagher knew Lancaster. He had walked every path, he had sighted every defensive position. He was, by any measure, exactly right about the terrain. On December 7, 1944, he wrote in his command diary, "The Americans will follow the call trail, they have no choice, their vehicles demand it. Their instinct for open ground demands it. The forest will do what the forest has always done. We will be waiting at the place they must reach." He was right about everything, except one man's willingness to go somewhere the forest said was impossible. Gallagher, standing at the edge of the tree line at 2200 hours on December 11, studied the aerial photograph by the light of a shielded torch. He traced the tree line with his finger. Then he looked at the actual forest outside the command post window, the way the branches overlapped, the absolute darkness underneath, the way the pine trunks stood like columns in a building where the floor and ceiling had dissolved. He put the photograph down. "This shows us the top of the problem," he told his platoon lieutenant, "not the problem." December 12, 1944, 5:30 hours. The forest in December before dawn is a specific kind of darkness, not the darkness of a room where light has been switched off. The darkness of something that has mass and direction, a darkness you can push against with your hand and feel it push back. At 5:30 the temperature was 6 degrees Celsius, and the pine branches held a layer of frost that made movement through them audible at 30 meters. Gallagher set the pace from the front. One step, pause, listen, one step. The resistance contact who was supposed to mark the German forward position, a white cloth tied to the second fence post on the left side of the forest path, a detail arranged through a Belgian network that battalion had used twice before, was not there. The fence post was there, the cloth was not. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had removed the cloth, or the contact had been taken, or the cloth had never been put there because the network had already been rolled up by the Gestapo, and no one at battalion had been told. In forest warfare, wrong intelligence is not a setback. It is an ambush you are already inside. Gallagher was 60 meters into the tree line, his squad in single file behind him when he registered the silence, not absence of sound, presence of a specific silence. The kind that happens in a forest when the birds have already decided to leave. He raised his fist. The column stopped. He had approximately 3 seconds with that information before the tree to his left disintegrated from the inside out. The MG-42 was firing from 15 meters away. The crew had let the column move past their concealed position and were now firing into the column's left flank. The first burst hit Private Danny Kowalczyk through the right shoulder, and the force of it dropped him sideways into the undergrowth, and he was gone from sight, immediately swallowed by the brown fern layer and dead brush. And for 3 full seconds, no one in the column knew if he was alive or dead or where his body was. This is what forest warfare does in the first second. It does not give you a clear target. It gives you sound from 3 directions simultaneously. a man who has vanished into undergrowth 6 feet from where he was standing, and the knowledge that the ground you are standing on was chosen by someone who has had more time to think about it than you have. The second MG-42 opened from the northeast. The third was further back on the ridge, not firing yet, waiting. The pattern was textbook Waldkampf, 2 guns to funnel the column toward the low ground between 3 ridgelines, a third gun waiting at the natural collection point. The Germans had drawn this engagement on a map before Gallagher had ever entered the trees. They had been waiting for men to walk into the shape they had built. Corporal Jesse Taft took a round that grazed the rim of his helmet, the impact spinning him, dropping him to one knee, concussed but functional, working on instinct rather than clarity. PFC Raymond Okaffer, on point when the firing began, was unhurt but pinned behind a fallen spruce, unable to lift his head without exposing it to the northeast gun. The radio call came at 5:47. The company commander's voice, crackling through the heavy canopy interference that made every radio transmission in the Hürtgen into a partial sentence. Gallagher, we're getting reports of a company strength force at the road junction. Division wants you to disengage. New orders incoming. Pull back to the assembly area and wait. The assembly area was behind him. Behind him was 30 meters of ground now covered by the first MG-42. The order was based on what headquarters knew. A German company at the road junction, Gallagher's unit engaged. Headquarters did not know the specific geometry of the ambush. Headquarters did not know that the path of retreat was the most dangerous direction. Headquarters did not know, could not know from a map, that the forest had been shaped around the specific expectation that the American squad would do exactly what this order was telling them to do. Follow the order blindly or exercise the judgment of a man who can see what the map cannot show. This was Eisenhower's doctrine made flesh, and it was terrible. At 5:53, in the 275th Infantry Division command post at Burgstein, Hauptmann Werner Struck received a field report from the ambush site and wrote in his command diary, 6:15, the American squad has not withdrawn as projected. Their movement pattern is planwidrig, contrary to doctrine, contrary to what terrain logic demands. They have not moved toward the assembly ground. I cannot account for their current position in my dispositions, requesting clarification from regiment. Planwidrig, contrary to plan. Contrary to what any soldier trained in terrain analysis would project, Gallagher pulled his 7 remaining effective fighters into a tight perimeter around a stand of old-growth pine, trees 2 feet in diameter, the only reliable cover in their immediate area. He had 17 minutes of pre-dawn darkness left. He had 2 men who needed medical attention he could not provide in the field. He had a radio that worked intermittently and orders he could not safely obey. He pressed his palm against the photograph through the fabric of his pocket. Then he stopped doing that because it was not useful. Then he looked at the trees, the actual trees, the specific trees, the way the roots ran, the way the frost had settled, the way the ground between 2 particular spruce trunks was slightly lower than the ground on either side. He started reading. A like on this video takes 2 seconds. For the men who made that decision under those trees with no backup and no daylight, it is the least we can do. Think about what it means to trust a sergeant. Not in the motivational sense, not trust your team as a philosophy for a conference room wall. In the operational sense, you have built an army of 3 million men. You are managing 67 divisions across a front that stretches from the North Sea to Switzerland. You are dealing with British generals who have different strategic objectives, French commanders whose priorities diverge from yours at every junction, and a logistical chain so complex that the failure of a single railway bridge in Belgium can halt an armored advance for a week. And you choose in this environment to write a directive that says, the man on the ground knows something the map does not show, train him to act on it. That is not a small decision. That is a structural bet on human judgment at the lowest possible level, a bet that the most important tactical decisions in a forest in Germany will be made correctly not by the general with the maps but by the sergeant with the trees. Eisenhower made that bet, deliberately. Repeatedly, it was documented in his operational philosophy, in his correspondence with Bradley and Montgomery, in the Field Manual 710 that governed American infantry small unit tactics, and in the culture of every unit that had moved through his command structure long enough to absorb it. The objective matters. The method is yours. Tom Gallagher had absorbed it. He may never have read the directive, he didn't need to. It had come down through every level of his training, every after-action review where an officer had said, you made the right call with the information you had, every moment where American small unit culture had reinforced the same message, you are not executing a plan, you are pursuing an objective. The forest between you and that objective is a resource, not an obstacle. German doctrine had trained the opposite instinct. Not because German officers were inferior, Hauptmann Struck was a thoughtful, experienced commander, but because German doctrine was built around the plan as the fundamental unit of military action. The plan was sound, the terrain was correct. The enemy would respond in the projected manner because the plan accounted for all variables. When the enemy did something planwidrig, something the plan had not accounted for, the German command response was to seek clarification from higher headquarters, to check the plan against the situation. To find out where the situation had diverged from what doctrine said it should be. This took time that Gallagher was spending looking at trees. He saw three things the German map had wrong. A dry creek bed, running perpendicular to the German right flank gun position, mapped as impassable terrain, because in spring it ran with snowmelt, and in summer it was overgrown, and aerial photography taken in September had shown it as solid undergrowth. In December, frozen, it was a navigable corridor approximately 18 inches wide, running directly behind the position. A section of old-growth spruce on the eastern edge of the perimeter, mapped as solid undergrowth that from ground level had a natural gap at the root line. 30 centimeters of clear space between the root masses invisible from above traversable by a man who was willing to move on his elbows for 15 meters, and accept that the forest floor in December is frozen mud that tastes like the beginning of things, and the wind direction. The canopy was channeling sound from the west. Any movement from the east would arrive acoustically late, not silent, late enough. He had a plan. It used the creek bed the Germans said was impassable, the gap the aerial photographs said didn't exist, and a wind direction that German doctrine had not built into the defensive design of this sector, because Waldkampf's defensive principles were designed for a generic forest, not this specific forest on this specific morning, with this specific frost pattern. He had to tell one Belgian family about it first. In a stone woodcutter's hut 40 meters north of the right flank German gun position, sheltering from the cold and the artillery that had been falling intermittently for 11 weeks, were three Belgian civilians: Henry Romain, 61, his daughter Elise, 30, and her daughter Marguerite, 4. They had been in the hut since October. They had heard the firefight. They were approximately 15 meters from where Gallagher's new plan would carry the fight. He could not warn them loudly. He could not approach them directly without crossing ground the German position could observe. He had 30 seconds before the pre-dawn darkness ended and movement became visible. He sent PFC Raymond Okaffer, who spoke no French, no Flemish, no German, and possessed exactly one relevant quality, which was a face that had never in its 23 years communicated anything other than honesty, to move to the hut's window and gesture, flat to the floor. Stay there, do not move no matter what happens. Okaffer used 22 seconds. He came back. Gallagher never asked what he'd seen through the window. The weight of other people's safety in a plan you are making in the dark is the specific kind of weight that does not need to be discussed. He chose, he carried it. If this story has stayed with you, if you want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did, this channel needs your subscription to keep telling stories like it. Part 4, The Breaking Point, December 12, 1944, 6:11 hours. 17 minutes before first light, Gallagher divided his 7 men. The first element, Corporal Taft, concussed but upright, and 2 others would stay in the original perimeter and make enough deliberate, disciplined noise to hold the German gunners' attention on a fixed position, short bursts, spaced. Nothing that would draw a full response, only enough to maintain the ambushing forces' belief that the Americans were still where they were supposed to be. The second element, Gallagher, PFC Okaffer, and 2 others, Private Alan Prout, 22, from Akron, Ohio, and Private First Class William Decker, 24, from Cincinnati, would move through the dry creek bed, 40 meters, on their elbows, in 17 minutes of remaining darkness. In a forest in December, moving on your elbows through frozen mud, the specific challenge is not the cold. The cold is already total and has been total for weeks, and your body has adjusted to it the way bodies adjust to things they cannot change. The challenge is the noise. Every frozen leaf has a specific pitch. Every ice-crusted rock makes a specific sound when weight crosses it. You move at 1 step every 4 seconds because that is the pace at which the ambient sound of the forest, the wind in the canopy, the settling of frozen branches can mask your movement. You count. The man behind you touches the back of your field jacket so you know he is there without turning, because turning means lifting your head, and lifting your head means you become visible against the frost. 1, 2, 3, 4, move. Gallagher counted to himself the way his daughter would one day learn to count, 1 number at a time, the full weight of his attention on each one. The first moment everything nearly ended. At 12 meters into the creek bed, the right flank gun position traversed. Someone in Taft's element had fired at the wrong moment, a response to movement in the undergrowth, a German security patrol edging toward the perimeter, a decision made by a concussed man doing the best he could in the dark. The German crew heard it, found the direction, and traversed to engage. The arc of their traverse carried them through the creek bed's axis at 27 degrees, exactly the angle at which their muzzle would, if depressed 3 degrees, sweep the ground Gallagher's 4 men were lying in. They went flat, faces in frozen mud. Gallagher had a specific thought at this moment which he later described, in a debrief conducted January 3, 1945, as follows: "I thought about the creek bed in spring, what it must look like with the water in it. I thought about that because I needed something to do with my mind while I waited to find out if I was going to live. The gun traversed, it stopped, the crew settled, 15 seconds, then move. The second moment, at 31 meters with 9 meters left to the right flank position, Private Danny Kowalczyk, left in the original perimeter, his right arm useless, carrying a Browning automatic rifle in his left hand and his body brace, made a decision. Taft's element was under pressure. A German security team was probing the perimeter's eastern edge. Taft, concussed, was managing 3 men and 2 fronts. Kowalczyk stood in the forest, where standing means being visible and being visible means being shot, and fired the bar from the hip, one-armed, into the tree line between the perimeter and the security patrol. He was firing at sound and shadow. He was 19 years old and he had one good arm, and he understood that Gallagher had 9 meters left to go and needed 30 more seconds of confusion to get there. He bought them. He took a stick grenade fragment through the left thigh, buying them. He went down firing. Gallagher reached the German position at 6:23. The MG-42 crew was facing northwest. They had been facing northwest since the ambush began because the ambush had been designed around that direction, the direction Waldkampf doctrine said an American unit would approach from. The direction the aerial photographs confirmed was the avenue of advance, the direction that every piece of German training and institutional knowledge pointed toward as the threat. The dry creek bed was behind them. It was on the map as impassable. It did not occur to a soldier trained in Waldkampf to put a man on the impassable creek bed, because Waldkampf had already processed that variable and arrived at the correct conclusion. Impassable terrain requires no defense. The terrain was correctly mapped. The doctrine was sound. The Americans were still where they should not have been. Gallagher and Okaffer covered the last 3 meters. Prout and Decker had the north side. The engagement lasted 11 seconds. The left flank gun position, hearing the sudden cessation of fire from the right, not a pause, not a lull, a specific silence that every trained soldier knows means the crew is down, went a hasty withdrawal. The sound of it was the sound of men who have understood something faster than they can process it, moving through undergrowth at a speed that abandons every principle of forest movement, crashing rather than stepping, choosing speed over silence because silence is no longer the relevant variable. Gallagher keyed the radio at 6:31. His voice was level, not brave. Level the way a man's voice is level when every other option has been exhausted, and levelness is what remains. He gave the grid, he gave the status. He said the junction was clear. The radio operator at Battalion, years later, recalled that the thing that stayed with him from that transmission was not what Gallagher said but how he said it, like he was calling in a weather report, like the trees were just trees. Count the cost. Kowalczyk, right shoulder, left thigh, alive, evacuated. Private Alan Prout, shrapnel from the stick grenade that hit Kowalczyk, right forearm, functional wound. Corporal Taft, the concussion and a laceration that needed stitching. 2 others, minor. 11 men had entered the forest at 5:30. 11 men came out. The accounting of what it cost each of them to do that belongs to the silence that followed. From a recovered Wehrmacht after-action report, 275th Infantry Division, December 13, 1944, the American infantry assault of the night 12-13 December followed no established doctrine of forest approach. Movement was detected from the right flank, designated in our defensive plan as impassable terrain. Conduct of the assault was, again, planwidrig, outside what any terrain analysis would project. Hauptmann Struck has requested a full review of defensive assumptions in the Brandenburg-Burgstein sector. The right flank position cannot be accounted for within the current framework. Planwidrig, again, for the second time, a German officer reaching for the only word in his professional vocabulary that honestly described what he was looking at. His map was correct, his doctrine was sound. The Americans were still where they should not have been. December 13, 1944. 700 hours. The forest when it is over smells like pine resin and propellant, a combination that has no analogue in civilian life. That veterans of this war describe in letters home, and then cross out, because there is no point in describing a smell to someone who does not have the other half of the context. The silence that returns to a forest after a firefight does not creep back gradually. It returns all at once, like a door closing, and the completeness of it is almost physical. You can feel the forest resume itself around you, the birds returning to branches they had abandoned, the wind finding its way through the canopy again without the interruption of gunfire. Gallagher sat at the edge of the tree line where the German position had been. He took the photograph of Clara from his breast pocket. She was 3 months old in it. He was 26 years old in a German forest, and she was 3 months old in Milwaukee, and he had never held her. He did not write home that night. He would write home on December 19. The letter, preserved in the Wisconsin Historical Society archives, says nothing about the forest and everything about the things he intended to do when he got back to Lancaster, which is the letter of a man who has decided in the specific way that decisions get made after things like this that he is going to get back. He did get back. Clara is 81 years old. Hauptmann Werner Struck survived the war. He was captured in April 1945, repatriated in 1947, and provided an account of the Brandenburg sector engagements to the U.S. Army Historical Division that same year. From that account, what I understand now, which I did not understand in December 1944, is that the Americans had learned the forest from the inside while I had learned it from the manual. My manual was correct. It described the forest accurately, but a manual tells you what ground should do. It does not tell you what a soldier who refuses to read the manual will find in it. The assault of the 12th was, by every measure of German doctrine, planwidrig. I have come to believe that is exactly why it succeeded. Planwidrig, for the third and final time. Now spoken not in confusion, not in frustration, but in the particular backward light of a man who has finally understood what he missed, and found the honest word for it. The forest he had trusted was turned against him by men who had never read the same manual. Eisenhower received the consolidated after-action reports from the Hürtgen sector in late December 1944. He later wrote, in his memoir Crusade in Europe, "We learned that in a forest, the side that has done the most thinking wins before a shot is fired. After the shot is fired, it belongs to the sergeant." He was right. He had spent 2 years building an organization designed to make exactly that true. Here is what the Hürtgen taught that the textbooks hadn't written yet. Framework beats firepower. The 4th Infantry Division cleared its objectives in the southern Hürtgen not because it outgunned the Wehrmacht. It did not, but because its smallest tactical units carried a doctrine that valued terrain reading over terrain following. German Waldkampf was sophisticated, detailed, and correct for the forest, as the Germans had mapped it. It could not account for men who looked at the same trees and saw different options. Fixed systems break when confronted by men who refuse to be fixed by anything except the objective. Trust in the lowest level. Eisenhower's most consequential structural achievement in the European theater was not the logistics chain, though moving 5 million tons of supplies across the English Channel was an achievement that deserves its own video. It was this: he built a culture, documented in every after-action report from every forest engagement in the Western Campaign, in which a sergeant's assessment of what was between the trees was treated as valid data, not insubordination. Data, the private who notices the frost pattern, the corporal who hears the wind shift, the staff sergeant who presses his hand against a photograph and then puts it away and reads the ground, the calm that travels downward. Gallagher's voice on the radio at 6:31 was level because Eisenhower's organizational philosophy had made level voices at the lowest level of command a trained response, not a natural one. Calm, in an army, is not a personality trait. It is a force multiplier that travels from command philosophy through every rank and arrives, eventually, in the voice of a man calling in a grid reference from a creek bed behind a German position that was mapped as impassable. He was calm because he had been trained by an organization that believed he was capable of being calm. That is the most underrated sentence in the history of the Western Campaign. The Hürtgen Forest still stands. You can drive there today. Take the N258 from Aachen south into Belgium and back into Germany, and the forest will arrive around you the way forests always do, not gradually but all at once from every side, the light shifting as the canopy closes overhead. The trees that stand now are not the trees that were there in 1944. Those trees are mostly gone, destroyed in the most intense forest fighting the European theater produced, but the ground is the same ground. The ridgelines run the same way. The dry creek beds freeze the same way in December. There are no signs marking the position of the right flank MG42 at grid reference 423. 7. There is no monument to 11 men who went in and 11 men who came out. The forest does not keep those kinds of records. 23 miles west, at Henry Chapelle in Belgium, there is an American military cemetery, 7,992 white crosses and stars of David on a hillside above the Belgian countryside, maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. On a clear day you can see the tree line of the Hürtgen from the cemetery's western edge. The forest is still dark against the horizon, still patient, still waiting to be read by whoever comes next with the right question. Some of the men under those crosses went into that forest, not all of them came back out. The ones who came back because someone had taught them to read the ground rather than follow the map, and trusted them enough to act on what they found. That trust was built before the war. It was maintained during the war by a general who understood that the distance between a commander in Versailles and a sergeant in a creek bed is only ever as short as the doctrine connecting them. Tom Gallagher taught geography after the war. He returned to Lancaster in 1946, went back to the same high school and taught the same subject until 1981. He told his students very little about the forest. He told them everything about how to read a map, and everything about the gap between what a map shows and what the ground actually contains. Clara Gallagher Morris, interviewed in 2019, remembered that her father kept a single pine cone on his desk in the classroom for 35 years. He never explained where it came from. She knew eventually, she never asked. The forest keeps its records in its own way. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in the forests of Germany, France, or the Pacific, under any command in any unit, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What forest? Did they ever talk about what it was like to fight where you couldn't see 20 feet in any direction? Those memories exist in family conversations and nowhere else. Write them here.